Grady Beckett found the first loaf on a Tuesday morning in October, wrapped in a clean flour sack and still faintly warm when he bent to pick it up from the porch boards. He turned it over in his hands, looked left down the empty road, then right toward the cluster of buildings that made up most of Ashby Station, and saw nobody. The bread was dark and dense, studded with something that might have been seeds or grain he couldn't name. He took it inside without comment and ate 3 thick slices standing at his table, and whatever small question had formed in him when he found it stayed there, unanswered but not pressing. The second loaf appeared 4 days later, same wrapping, same hour, placed with the same care on the same spot. Grady stood in his doorway longer this time, coffee in hand, scanning the pre-dawn street. The mercantile was dark. The livery showed a thread of lamplight, but no movement. He picked up the bread and went back inside, and this time he set it on the shelf beside the first, which he had not quite finished. By the 3rd week of it, the town had begun to notice, the way a town notices anything that repeats itself without explanation. Vera Quill, who kept the boarding house 2 doors down from the mercantile, mentioned it to Bess Lund while settling her account for lamp oil. Bess told her husband Roy, who ran the store, and Roy mentioned it to Harlan Marsh, the livery man, while Harlan was paying for tobacco. Harlan said he'd seen Grady walking back from the depot one morning with a loaf under his arm, which wasn't quite right, but close enough that nobody corrected him. Within a month, the question had become a kind of low entertainment, the sort of thing people speculated about while waiting for the stage or watching the street from a porch rail. Grady himself had stopped wondering after the 4th loaf. He was not a man inclined to refuse what was freely given, and the bread was good, better than anything he could buy or make. He ate it with the last of his summer preserves, and later with nothing at all, and he kept the flour sacks folded in a drawer because they were clean and well made, and it seemed wasteful not to. He did not ask around. Asking would have required him to care more than he did, and Grady Beckett had learned a long time ago to take what came and let the rest go. He had arrived in Ashby Station the previous spring with a contract to break 6 horses for a rancher named Vance, who ran cattle and a small string of mares 15 miles south of town. The contract was finished by July, but Vance had liked his work and offered him a permanent position, which Grady accepted with a nod and no negotiation. He was 42, lean and weathered in the way of men who live outside, and he carried himself with the economy of someone who had spent years moving through the world without drawing attention. He rented a narrow house at the edge of town, 1 room and a kitchen, with a porch that faced east and caught the first light. He kept his belongings to what fit in a trunk and a saddlebag. He was not unfriendly, but neither was he the sort of man people felt moved to include, and that had always suited him fine. The woman who baked the bread was named Cora Whitaker, and she had lived in Ashby Station all her life, first as the daughter of the blacksmith, then as the wife of a freighter named Whitaker, who had died of fever 7 years earlier, and now as a woman who took in mending and baked for the hotel when they needed extra for a crowd. She was 36 and plain-faced, with strong hands and a capable way of moving that made people step aside for her without thinking about it. She had no children. The town had long since stopped expecting her to remarry, and she had stopped expecting it herself. She had first seen Grady Beckett in June, the morning after a summer storm had torn half the shingles off the church roof and left the street a mess of broken branches and standing water. He had been walking past her house at first light, carrying an axe, and she had watched from her kitchen window as he stopped at the church steps, looked up at the damaged roof, and then spent the next 3 hours cutting and stacking the fallen limbs into cords that the minister could use or sell. He did not go inside to announce himself. He did not wait to be thanked. When he finished, he walked back the way he had come, and Cora stood at her window long after he was out of sight, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in her hands. She saw him again 2 weeks later at the mercantile, buying cornmeal and lard, and she noticed the way he counted his money carefully before he paid, and the way he carried the sack tucked under one arm as though it were something he was used to carrying alone. She did not speak to him. She had no reason to, and she was not a woman who invented reasons. But she thought about him that evening while she kneaded dough for the hotel's breakfast, and she thought about him again the next week when she passed his house and saw a shirt hanging on the line, mended at the shoulder with stitches that were functional but graceless, the kind a man makes when he has no one to do it better. The first loaf had been an impulse, or as close to an impulse as Cora allowed herself. She had baked an extra round, wrapped it the way she wrapped the hotel's orders, and walked to his porch in the dark before the town woke. She left it and went home and did not let herself think about whether he would know, or guess, or care. When the loaf was gone 2 days later and the flour sack left folded on his porch rail, she baked another. By winter, the bread had become a rhythm she did not examine, the way a habit becomes when it serves a need that has no name. She baked for him once a week, sometimes twice if the week had been lean, and she thought he might be working long days without proper meals. She varied the loaves, adding oats or seeds or dried apple when she had them, and she always wrapped them in the same clean sacks, which he always returned, folded and placed on the rail where she could retrieve them before dawn. They never spoke. She never signed the bread or left a note. He never waited on the porch to catch her. The arrangement was perfect because it required nothing. And Cora had learned long ago that the best kindnesses were the ones nobody had to acknowledge. The town, however, was not content to leave it unnamed. By December, the question of the bread had become a fixture of local conversation, debated with the kind of low-stakes pleasure people reserve for mysteries that do not matter. Vera Quill was convinced it was the minister's wife, acting on some charitable instinct she declined to explain. Bess Lund thought it might be the widow Prescott, who lived alone at the north end of town and was known to bake in bulk. Roy Lund suggested it was one of the ranch wives, someone Grady had worked for who felt obliged to feed him, though he could not say which one. Harlan Marsh, who enjoyed being contrary, said it was probably Grady himself, baking his own bread and pretending otherwise to avoid conversation, which made no sense but was the sort of theory Harlan favored. No one suggested Cora Whitaker. She was too plain, too self-contained, too much a fixture of the town's practical landscape to be considered in a story that had taken on the shape of a romance. She was the woman you went to when you needed a coat let out or a hem repaired, not the woman you imagined leaving gifts in the dark. She did not mind. She had stopped minding a long time ago. Grady, for his part, remained unaware of the speculation. He worked long days at the Vance Ranch, breaking colts and repairing tack and doing the 100 small tasks that kept a horse operation running. He came home after dark most nights, ate whatever he had, and slept soundly. He did not frequent the boarding house or linger at the mercantile. He attended church irregularly and spoke only when spoken to. If people were talking about him, he did not hear it, and if he had heard it, he would not have cared. The bread kept coming, through the first snow, through the hard cold of January, through the false spring of February that turned back to ice. Cora baked and walked and left her loaves, and Grady found them and ate them, and the town watched and theorized and never guessed. It was Vera Quill who finally saw her. Late March, an hour before dawn, Vera woke with a cough she could not shake and went to her kitchen for water. From her window, she saw a figure walking east down the empty street, a woman in a dark coat carrying something wrapped in cloth. Vera squinted, leaned closer to the glass, and recognized the shape of Cora Whitaker, just as Cora turned onto the path that led to Grady Beckett's porch. Vera watched her set the bundle down, straighten, and walked back the way she had come, her steps quick and purposeful, her face hidden in the pre-dawn shadow. Vera told Bess the next morning, and Bess told Roy, and Roy told Harlan, and by evening the whole town had revised its theory with the speed and certainty of people who are pleased to have been wrong. Cora Whitaker. Of course. It made a kind of sense, the sort of sense that seems obvious only in retrospect. The quiet widow and the quiet drifter, the woman who mended and the man who fixed. It was a better story than the minister's wife or a ranch obligation, and the town accepted it with satisfaction and began waiting to see what would happen next. What happened next was nothing, or what looked like nothing. Spring came in earnest. The road dried. Grady worked and Cora baked, and the loaves continued to appear. And if either of them knew the town was watching, they gave no sign. The only change was that Harlan Marsh, who had a sentimental streak he hid behind gruffness, began to nod at Cora when she came into the livery to collect her mending customers, and Vera Quill made a point of saving the best flour sacks for her when she came to settle her accounts. The test came in late April, when a man named Coyle rode into town and asked after Cora Whitaker at the Mercantile. He was her late husband's brother, a broad-shouldered man with an easy smile and a way of talking that assumed agreement. He had come, he said, to make her an offer. He had married a woman with 3 children in a town 2 days south, and his new wife needed help with the house and the youngest boy, who was sickly. Cora could come live with them, he said. She would have her own room, her own work, a place in a family again. It was a generous offer, he said, and he expected her to see it that way. Cora listened to him in the sitting room of the boarding house where Vera had shown him when he asked for a place to wait. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed, and when he finished talking, she thanked him for his trouble and told him no. Coyle frowned. He had not expected refusal. He tried again, explaining the advantages, the security, the loneliness of a woman living alone. Cora let him finish and told him no a second time, more firmly. Coyle's face darkened. He said something about stubbornness and wasted years, and Cora stood and walked out of the room, and that was the end of it. Grady heard about it the next day from Harlan, who had heard it from Vera, who had been listening from the hallway. Harlan told the story with a kind of dry approval, noting that Coyle had left town that same afternoon looking sour. Grady listened and said nothing, but something shifted in him, some small question that had been forming without his knowledge. That evening he stayed on his porch after dark, and when he saw a figure coming up the road in the last of the light, he stood and waited. Cora stopped when she saw him. She was carrying a loaf wrapped in a flour sack, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then Grady stepped down from the porch and walked to meet her, and when he reached her, he took the loaf from her hands and held it the way a man holds something he has been given and does not intend to return. "You've been leaving this," he said. She nodded. "I want to pay you," he said. "No," she said. "Then I want to thank you," he said. She shook her head. "You don't need to." He looked at her for a long moment, this plain-faced woman with strong hands and a steady gaze, and he thought about the months of bread and the care it represented, the early mornings and the thought behind each loaf, and he understood that she had been seeing him long before he had seen her. "I'd like to sit with you," he said, "if you're willing." She looked at him, and something crossed her face that might have been surprise, or relief, or the beginning of hope. She nodded once, and he gestured toward the porch, and they walked back together and sat on the steps as the last light faded and the stars came out, and neither of them said much, but the silence was easy, the kind of silence that holds more than words. By summer they were married, a quiet ceremony at the church with Vera and Harlan and a handful of others standing witness. Cora moved into the narrow house at the edge of town, and Grady built a second room and a larger kitchen, and the town watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction, pleased to have been right, and pleased to have kept its theories mostly to itself. 20 years later, on a morning in October, Grady Beckett woke before dawn and found his wife already in the kitchen, her hands in a bowl of dough, her face calm in the lamplight. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her, and she smiled at him without pausing in her work. He sat at the table and watched her shape the dough into rounds, and after a while he said, "That first loaf? The one you left? Did you know I'd been the one who cleared the church branches?" She looked up, her hands stilling. "I saw you," she said. He nodded slowly. "I thought maybe you had." She went back to her work, and he drank his coffee, and the bread rose in the warmth of the kitchen as the sky outside began to pale. Later, when the loaves were baked and cooling on the rack, Cora wrapped one in a clean flour sack and handed it to him, and Grady took it the way he had taken the first one all those years ago, with both hands and without question. He set it on the table between them, and they sat together in the morning quiet, and the world went on around them, and that was enough.